Who rules the world? Who runs the world? Well, during lockdown we've had plenty of chances to watch the posturing of national leaders as they respond to the crisis and attempt to bolster their claims to be international leaders, world leaders, to varying degrees of success, let's be honest. Brazilian President Bolsonaro has been claiming that he is above the virus, but now he's succumbed to it. Trump has been claiming some kind of insider knowledge about how to treat COVID-19, but his own claims to be a leading power in the world are undermined by federal versus state arguments about lockdown, and of course, more seriously, his posturing when it comes to the horrendous police brutality. Our own Prime Minister has set out an agenda that he hopes will see us lockdown free by Christmas, even if the virus is still around, of course to some vociferous criticisms. And into the mix we add the immovable Dominic Cummings and the claims that we're just following the science. So perhaps advisors and scientists really rule the world. Some of this, of course, I say in jest, but there's just enough of a hint of a truth, I think, sometimes to make us a little bit uncertain. The question of who rules the world is one that is very, very important for the world to understand. The world in terms of those who oppose God's rule. The secular worldview in which we live and breathe at the moment has to have an answer, otherwise the obvious ruler of the world is chance and circumstance when there is no God. And even atheists know that this way lies madness. This question is also thrown about in the arts. Beyonce, if you can think back all the way to 2011, 9 years ago, released a song called Run the World Girls, encapsulating in song the Eleanor Roosevelt quote that goes something along the lines of, behind every great man there is a great woman. Actually, the claim there is that girls, women, they run the world, really, and they allow the men to go about their business just thinking they do. Well, so who rules the world? Who rules the world? Well, while all these squabble and posture, the Bible gives us a very different presentation of who is in charge and who rules the world. Jesus Christ is the true King of the world. And in the midst of all these competing claims, and in the midst of competing claims for kingship of the world back in Bible times, John in the book of Revelation has a vision of Jesus Christ that sets John right and sets us right as Jesus' people here today. And that's what I want to think about for a moment. We're in Revelation chapter 1, verses 12 to 18. And let me read that to you. This is John. He is describing the vision that he sees of Jesus Christ. This is what it says. I turned around to see the voice that was speaking to me, and when I turned I saw 7 golden lampstands, and among the lampstands was someone like a son of man, dressed in a robe reaching down to his feet, and with a golden sash around his chest. The hair on his head was white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were like a blazing fire. His feet were like bronze, glowing in a furnace, and his voice was like the sound of rushing waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars, and coming out of his mouth was a sharp double-edged sword. His face was like the sun shining in all its brilliance. When I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. Then he placed his right hand on me and said, Do not be afraid. I am the first and the last. I am the living one. I was dead, and now look, I am alive forever and ever, and I hold the keys to death and Hades. What a vision! What a vision of Jesus. Now, did you notice that John keeps saying that the person he saw, Jesus Christ, was like this and was like that? John's describing something that doesn't quite fit into a nice, neat description. Human words aren't quite enough to describe Jesus Christ, the true King. But because human words are all that he's got, he gives it a good go. And because because human words aren't enough, he relies on a vision that Daniel had back in the book of Daniel in the Old Testament, in chapter 7, about one called the Son of Man, who approached the Ancient of Days. The Ancient of Days being another name for God, and this Son of Man was given authority and sovereignty and power over all nations, and all nations of the world came and worshipped the Son of Man. Now, John sees this being fulfilled in Jesus Christ. So he sees someone walking amongst the lampstands who looks like the Son of Man. This is the one who has all authority and sovereignty and power over all the nations of the world. Here is the true king. And we know it's Jesus because of what John says in verses 17 to 18, just at the end of our reading there. But before we get there, let's look at how Jesus is described. He wears a robe that goes down to his feet and a golden sash around his chest. Here's a kind of coming together of priest and king images. If you want to know more about Jesus, the great high priest, go and watch John Grayston's video, the sermon from last week, where he talks about Jesus as the great high priest. Well, Jesus walks amongst his churches. That's the 7 lampstands. We're told that a bit later on in Revelation. This is his universal church. He is in control of the universal church. And that's the bit that's about the priest. He does so as priest and as king, though. In the Roman army, an image that was seared onto the minds of all who lived in the Roman Empire, the longer your robe, the higher your rank. So here is one whose robe goes down to his feet with a gold sash around him. He is above military might. They all obey him. He is in authority. His hair is as white as wool and snow. Here's a very specific allusion to Daniel chapter 7, where God is described as the Ancient of Days and has white hair. So John is saying that this Son of Man, Jesus, is also the Ancient of Days. Jesus, the man, is fully God. Jesus is God and man. His eyes are like blazing fire. This describes Jesus' ability to see clearly and therefore truthfully. And because he can see, he can therefore judge rightly and justly. He is exercising the prerogatives of a king who can see hearts and therefore judge with justice. His feet are like glowing bronze. Again, here we have allusions to the Ancient of Days and of Judgment, glowing because they're in a furnace. Fire doesn't just destroy, but it purifies. And that's what Jesus' judgment does. It doesn't just destroy, but it also makes pure. His voice is like the sound of rushing waters, and his face is like the sun. We're back in Daniel, and this time in chapter 10, where Daniel sees a figure whose glory bowls him over, but who empowers Daniel then to speak of a cosmic battle that the Son of Man, who John identifies as Jesus, would win. So later on in verses 17 into 18 in our passage, we see that Jesus describes himself as the one who was dead but is now alive, and holding the keys to death and Hades. Now this is a description of the victory that he has won in this cosmic battle that Daniel looked forward to, that John saw complete in Jesus, and that we look back to. This cosmic battle between God and Satan, between good and evil, is not something that is still to come. It is something that has already happened at the cross of Christ. We rejoice in that. And Jesus then holds 7 stars in his right hand, and we're back here contrasting Jesus, the true king, with the pretenders of his day. In John's time, the great pretender to be the ruler of the world was Caesar, the emperor of Rome. The emperor Domitian produced a coin that showed his heir, his son, who had actually died in childhood, as the baby Zeus playing with stars. The point was to try and make clear to the Roman Empire, the normal people in the empire, that his son, the emperor's son, was, even though he'd died in childhood, was reigning in heaven. And even if he wouldn't reign on earth, he would reign there amongst the stars. But John says that this is that the true king is the one who reigns in heaven and on earth, and that Jesus, who died, is now alive, and he reigns supreme. It's not about the emperor's son anymore. What authority there is in the world that's used by world leaders is just a shadow and a mirage of the true authority that Jesus Christ reigns with as the true king of the heavens and the earth. And John wants us to see that whatever claims are being made by people in this world, Jesus trumps them. Jesus, his authority is far, far above them. The claims to authority that people have here are just paddling in the mud compared to Jesus' authority over the heavens and the earth. And then Jesus has a sword coming out of his mouth, and this represents his power to judge. Hebrews 4, verses 12 to 13 tell us that the word of God is a double-edged sword. So Jesus rules powerfully by his word, the testimony of his death and resurrection, and the testimony of who he is as God's own son. The power of his word is like a sharp sword, dividing bone from marrow, revealing the innermost thoughts of all humans. It is a sword that brings judgment and salvation, that brings wounding and healing. This, then, is Jesus, the true King. When all the world is raging, and there are forces that seem to be vying for control of the world, whether that's international leaders, whether that's natural things like the virus, whether it seems to be cosmic forces, well, Jesus rules. And John here invites you, to look at Jesus, the true King. So how then do we respond to that? Well, we read that John, when he sees Jesus, sees this vision of Jesus the true King in all his glory, falls at Jesus' feet as though he were dead. No one can see me and live, God says that to Moses back in Exodus, when Moses had asked to see God's glory. And that seems to be what's happening here. John has seen the glory of the God-man Jesus Christ, and now it's as if he's dead. And in a sense, folks, that's utterly correct. We must not seek to tame the glory of Jesus. Too often we've tamed Jesus to the extent that, in essence, he becomes our own little domesticated God, a kind of wishmaker to turn to in hard times. But that is not the God-man presented here in the Bible. That is not the Jesus Christ, the Son of God, presented to us in Revelation. Here, Jesus Christ is glorious, so full of majesty and glory that those who look upon him collapse at his feet as if they're dead. There is no doubt that John has experienced torture and persecution. He's on the island of Patmos because he's been exiled as a political prisoner. Yet he is not turning to Jesus here to remove his pain, his sorrow, his sadness. He turns to Jesus and falls at his feet, seeing his glory and honour. He knows that God is not like us, that God is full of glory and majesty, and his ways are not like ours, that he works out his purposes in this world just as he likes to. But then, just as it seems like Jesus Christ is so far unlike us to be unreachable, that all that glory and authority and sovereignty over the world as the true King would cause us harm rather than good, Jesus speaks. He reaches out his hand and places it on John and says, "Do not be afraid." In the midst of all his glory, Jesus Christ, the true King, is good and gracious, is gentle and kind. Do not be afraid. All who come to him, who trust in him, who put their faith in him, all who turn to him in the midst of their own sin, repenting, he reaches out to them. All who put their faith in him, the one who is both too glorious for us to look at, but at the same time kneels with us and tells us, do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. We're to respect and honour the glory of Jesus Christ, but we're not to fear him. He is the first and the last. He is before all things and after all things. And he has all authority, not only over the world as its true King, but because he is the living one who was dead and is now alive, he also has authority over death and Hades. He holds the keys of death and Hades. He's won the cosmic battle of it in his death. He rose again victorious over sin and Satan, all evil, and even death itself. This is our King, the glorious living one, Jesus Christ. Every knee will bow, says Paul. Every knee will bow. In his letters to the early Christians, he said, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess one day that Jesus Christ is indeed Lord. All those who claim to rule the world now will bow at the coming of Jesus Christ as the one true King. The joy that we have now, the wonder, the delightful wonder, is that we get to bow before him and proclaim him as King here and now, ahead of time. All glory to Jesus Christ, the one true